Journal of Exploration in Vastaya Territory, by Eduard Santangelo, 0.5s. This is the Journal of Observations, Theories, and Meditations on the Chimeric Creatures of the Northern Lands of Ionia. Reported by Eduard Santangelo, gentleman, explorer, and historian. My first experience with the chimeric creatures known as Vastayas dates back to my landing on the fertile shores of Ionia. I hope to find there a cure for a typically Piltovan ailment that some call marasmus, the sweet existential boredom that my daily life in the proud and inflexible city of progress inspires in me, where I earn my living as a renowned author. Venturing into the magic-shrouded lands of Ionia, unknown to all cartographers who weren't born there, I hope to find something to push the boundaries of my field of expertise. Things that were wondrous, magical, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. When I discovered the Vastayas, the name given by the natives to these creatures, I understood that I had found what I was looking for. I met my first Vastaya in the dead of night, as he was rummaging through my camp hoping to find something to fill his throat. When he nearly ran away at full speed upon hearing me approach, I managed to convince him to stay by handing him a handful of biscuits and humming him a soothing lullaby I had learned from my mother. My vocal range, you see, lends itself admirably well to seductive songs. Although he was bipedal like humans, he displayed the physical characteristics of many other creatures whose existence I had noted in my readings or during my many travels. His upturned nose and long whiskers were those of a cat, his body was covered in snake scales, and he had the strength of a salt monster from Bilgewater. I noted this last fact when, having swallowed my biscuits, he lifted me into the air with disconcerting ease and held me in that position while he checked that I was not hiding any other treats in my sleeping bag. When, a few moments later, the creature fled into the darkness, I knew with certainty that these Vastayas would be my new subject of research. Below you will find my notes relating to the different species of Vastayas that I encountered during my exploration of this mysterious continent. If I were to offer a hypothesis as to the origin of these beings, which I believe I can allow myself as a gentleman well-versed in natural sciences, I would say that the Vastayas do not represent a single species, but constitute a broader level of taxonomic classification, more akin to a branch, or phylum. Thus, although many Vastayas appear perfectly similar, which I discovered by following the boy from my first encounter to his village and being rudely chased away by his brothers with the same hybridity, perhaps they had taken me for a spy or a predator, which explains why they then followed me to my camp to relieve me of my supplies. The different tribes and families that compose them actually act in radically different ways. A few days after my encounter with the Vastayas, I followed the Whispering River. I had named it that because it was terribly noisy, and because, like any refined person, I am a great lover of irony, which was near their village, thinking that such a source of water would attract other specimens. I thus discovered a whole new tribe. These Vastayas had the soft, downy faces of otters, but the bodies of seals. After unsuccessfully attempting to offer them my glasses as a token of peace, since most of them carried bags filled with flashy trinkets, I assumed they might be a merchant society. I launched into an impromptu dance intended to demonstrate my peaceful intentions. This dance relied primarily on knee placement, and as it happens, my kneecaps are still remarkably agile. This demonstration encouraged my companions to welcome me and set aside some of their hot supper for me, which appeared to be some kind of boiled fish. Though my ritualistic gestures left them speechless at first, they later revealed, politely asking me to give them a cup containing a yellowish powder with a strong, salty odor, that they actually spoke my language fluently. I was unfamiliar with their dialect and expressions, but I still managed to understand them without too much effort. As hungry for knowledge as I was for food, I hastened to question them about the origins of their species. I learned that the origins of the Vastaya dated back to a very distant time, when a group of humans fleeing the Great Void War took refuge in a remote corner of Ionia. I have discussed this war extensively in my previous works, which you can find at the best bookstores in Piltover at very reasonable prices. These refugees came into contact with a tribe of intelligent, shape-shifting creatures who lived in perfect harmony with the residual magic of Ionia. The union of these two groups gave rise to the beings now known as the Vastaya. Over the ages, the descendants of this intermingling settled in many regions and adopted different forms, ranging from the winged humanoids of Ionia to the sand beasts of Shurima, some of which are missing limbs, and including those famous scaled manatees of Freljord with their perpetually awkward expression. I would have loved to stay with these otter men, but one of my questions seemed to offend them so deeply that I was unceremoniously expelled from the village, thus losing their favor. For those who might wish to avoid the same mistake, my question simply sought to determine whether the interbreeding between the two species was purely magical or, shall we say, of a more physical nature. Relieved of my baggage and my composure, but never of my thirst for adventure, I immediately decided on a new direction, protected only by my courage and my multisyllabic vocabulary. Months passed during which I drew my sustenance from the fruits and vegetables of Ionia, abundant and as easy to gather from the earth and trees as from the stalls of the neighboring markets. Sunrise and sunset were the only markers of time, and I gradually forgot the tiresome Piltovan customs to which I had grown accustomed. To be perfectly honest, after a few weeks of wandering through Ionia, I had developed a certain slant. After verifying my solitude, a man of the world would not impose his nudity on innocent eyes. I undressed and entered a nearby lake that smelled of fresh grass and berries. It was there that I saw the most wonderful thing of my entire existence, and I know that I will never see anything like it again, even if I were to live 1,000 years. It was a creature far more human than any of the Vastayas I had met so far, bathing on the opposite bank. Without going into details that might disturb the chaste reader, it was naked and had all the trappings of a woman, but its ears and tail, or tails, were those of a fox. What a woman! I barely caught sight of him as I plunged into the pond, my mouth wide open, rivulets of water cascading over my gaunt frame, desperately searching for a proper greeting. Perhaps I should introduce myself as a renowned man of letters and quote some of the most flattering articles written about me? Perhaps a serenade would be more appropriate? After all, I had composed and memorized many romantic ballads for occasions of this kind. However, a rustling in the grass behind me jolted me out of my hesitation. I turned around on pure instinct, but as no creature had shown itself brave enough to appear, I looked again in the direction of the magnificent foxwoman. Alas, she had vanished, leaving me with only questions and the opening lines of "Oh my love, my adventure, all we need is a blanket" on the tip of my tongue. The creature behind me, whom I most desperately wanted to beat until he bled for frightening the love of my life, turned out to be a human merchant from a distant village. His specialty was rusai, a type of fruit that was apparently a delicacy, but which I preferred not to taste so as not to be tempted to smash it in his face. Shai, for that was his name, scolded me for bathing in the pond, informing me that it was all the more detrimental to my health because the foxwoman often bathed there. I then explained to him that creeping up behind naked men in love could prove far more dangerous, but he only laughed. After getting dressed again, I convinced the merchant to take me back to civilization and answer some of my questions, at the price of my hat, Genro haberdashery, 53 gears retail. He explained that his family had known this strange woman for generations, her longevity, like that of all Vastayas, far exceeding that of humans. Some are said to be able to live for thousands of years. Others, according to legends and rumors, are immortal. Shai informed me of the Ionian name for these creatures, which until then I had called phantasmas, a term that seemed to confuse my interlocutor. Therefore, out of pure cultural respect, I changed all previous references to phantasmas in my notes, my humility being that my vocabulary is as vast as it is extensive. Together we walked for several days. From time to time, the merchant would stop to sniff the air like a hungry hunting dog. When I asked him to explain his behavior, he simply smiled and confessed to searching for treasure. Although all this struck me as exasperating, albeit in an unusual way, his dog-like sniffing sparked a thought in me that I immediately shared with him. If the Vastaya were an amalgam of humans and distant shape-shifting ancestors, what would happen in the event of extreme dilution of the bloodline during reproductive generations? And if, say, someone had Vastaya blood, but not enough to be able to assume the animal form of the chimeras? What would happen then? He stopped sniffing then and his eyes widened. He looked at me, smiled and replied, "Who says they can't change shape again?" Immediately, the fellow transformed into a pig to unearth some satiny truffles. I was shocked to have encountered a shapeshifter, even for a scholar of my caliber. Crossing paths with 3 varieties of Vastayas in just a few months was the height of extraordinary luck. However, I remained observant enough to note that going from a voluptuous foxwoman to a mushroom-sniffing pigman was hardly progress. At this rate, my next Vastaya was going to turn out to be a cockroach. I have been scouring Ionia for the past few months in the hope of gathering as much information as possible on the various species of Vastayas, in order to compile a comprehensive taxonomic guide to Runeterra and its fauna. Although I have accumulated a considerable amount of information on the Vastayas, there is still much to discover, and I fear that by limiting my research to Ionia, a large part of the diversity of species falling under this classification will escape me. Nevertheless, for now, it is time for me to move forward. I have only cracked open the door to the world of the Vastaya, and crossing the threshold will be the work of another. Today, I focus my efforts on other creatures of Runeterra whose stories remain to be told. those terrible, sentient weapons known as Dakin. The corrupting creatures of the void. Those elusive creatures of legend, the Yordles. It cannot be allowed that no one should speak of them, and, on my word of honor, I will be the explorer who describes them. I may well be, in fact, the only one capable of doing so. Editor's note. Only 2 weeks after sending this manuscript, Mr. Santangelo undertook an unofficial return trip to Ionia in order, in his own words, to gather more information about the lady with fox attributes, solely with a view to an expanded edition. Several weeks later, we received a letter from Mr. Santangelo written in these terms. I fear I have been unwittingly kidnapped. My captors, a dubious coterie of ruffians calling themselves the Navari Brotherhood, suspect me of spying for Piltover. Of course, as a man of the world endowed with the most varied intellectual, romantic, and athletic abilities, such as, abbreviated for fear of excessive length, I felt insulted by this accusation. I nevertheless managed to convince them to demand a ransom for my release instead of carrying me out immediately. If it would be possible for you, therefore, to send some food, weapons, precious metals, anything that demonstrates the esteem you hold for me as an author, I would be eternally grateful. It is, of course, up to you to determine what expenses are appropriate to buy my return, but I fear that the bankruptcy of the publishing house and its investors is only the minimum wage. But who can doubt that it will be worth it? Upon receiving this letter, we immediately forwarded to Mr. Santangelo all the expected profits from his new work, namely small coins and a stale biscuit. We are still waiting to hear from him.